You know what humbled me faster than anything else in woodworking? Trying to bend a thick piece of white oak. I'm not talking about some thin strip for a canoe gunwale. I mean real timber, 2 inches thick, maybe 3. The kind of stock that fights you every step of the way. I cracked more boards than I care to admit, split them right down the middle, heard that sickening pop that tells you the whole piece is ruined, and there is nothing you can do about it. And every time, I thought I was doing something wrong. Turns out I was. But the answer was not in any modern woodworking manual I owned. It was sitting in the shipyards of the 1700s. Naval carpenters were bending oak timbers 8, 10, even 12 inches thick into the curved ribs of warships, and they were doing it without snapping them in half. When I finally understood how they pulled that off, it changed the way I think about wood entirely. Today, I am going to walk you through exactly what those shipwrights knew and how they did it. And stick around to the end, because I will share a soaking technique from the old yard records that I have never seen in a single modern bending guide. Let us get into it. Steam bending heavy oak is one of those skills that separates casual woodworking from real craftsmanship. And what the naval carpenters of the 1700s figured out about it was not just clever, it was grounded in real science, decades before anyone had the vocabulary to explain it. Once you understand their approach, you start to see why most of us struggle with bending and what we can do differently. So, let me give you some context on who these people were and what they were up against. In the 1700s, the great naval powers of the world, Britain, France, Spain, and eventually the young United States, were locked in an arms race fought entirely in wood. A single ship of the line for the British Royal Navy required around 2,000 mature oak trees, and the most critical structural components were the ribs, those curved frames that gave the hull its shape and its strength. Without properly curved ribs, a warship could not survive the open ocean. Now here is the problem. You cannot saw a curve out of a straight board and expect it to hold up under the stress of ocean waves. The grain runs out and the piece is weak. So the shipwrights needed to take straight oak timbers and bend them into precise curves, sometimes with a radius tight enough to form the bow of a 60-gun frigate. These were not hobbyists. These were men working in royal dockyards like Chatham and Portsmouth in England, or the Arsenal at Brest in France. They worked in teams of dozens, sometimes hundreds, with purpose-built infrastructure that most of us would barely recognize as woodworking equipment. And the guiding principle behind everything they did was simple. Do not fight the wood. Understand what it is made of, change its state temporarily, shape it while it cooperates, and then let it lock into its new form. That is not poetry, that is engineering. And once I understood that principle, every failure I had ever experienced with bending suddenly made sense. The first thing the shipwrights understood, and the first thing most of us get wrong, is that bending starts long before the steam box. It starts with selecting the right piece of wood. Naval carpenters were extremely particular about their bending stock. They preferred English oak, or, in American yards, white oak, specifically because of the density and structure of those species. But species alone was not enough. They wanted timber that was freshly felled or still green, not air-dried, certainly not kiln-dried. Green wood still has its original moisture trapped inside the cell walls, and that moisture is critical to what happens later in the steam box. Beyond moisture, they read the grain the way a river guide reads water. They looked for stock with straight, even grain running the full length of the piece. No knots, no wild figure, no interlocking grain. Any deviation was a stress point, a place where the wood would resist bending and eventually crack. They also paid attention to growth rate. Timber from slow-grown trees, the kind with tight, closely spaced growth rings, bent more predictably than fast-grown wood with wide rings. The slow-grown oak was denser and more uniform, and that uniformity meant the fibers would stretch and compress more evenly across the bend. Most of us in a modern shop grab whatever oak is available at the lumber yard. It is almost always kiln-dried, often with grain that runs every which way, and we wonder why it snaps. The shipwrights would have looked at that board and set it aside for planking or something flat. They never would have tried to bend it. That selection process was not optional. It was the foundation of everything that followed. Now, once they had the right stock, they needed to soften it. And this is where the steam boxes come in. Except calling them boxes does not do justice to what these actually were. At a major dockyard, the steam chest was a massive piece of infrastructure. Picture a long wooden chest, sometimes 20 feet or more in length, built from heavy planks and lined with sheet lead to hold in the heat and moisture. The chest was fed by a copper boiler, essentially a large kettle set over a brick furnace, with pipes running steam into one end of the chest. Vent holes at the far end let excess steam escape so pressure would not build up dangerously. The timbers were loaded inside, supported on rails so the steam could circulate all the way around them, and then they waited. The general rule that emerged from centuries of practice, and that still holds true today, is roughly 1 hour of steaming per inch of thickness. So a 3-inch oak timber needed about 3 hours, a 6-inch timber needed 6. For the truly massive pieces, the ones going into the keel frames of a ship of the line, steaming could take the better part of a full day. The temperature inside the chest needed to reach at least 212 degrees Fahrenheit, the boiling point of water, and stay there consistently. Too cool, and the wood would not soften enough. Too short a time, and only the outer layers would be pliable, while the core remained rigid and brittle. The shipwrights knew this from hard experience. They did not have thermometers in the modern sense. They judged readiness by time, by the feel of the steam escaping the vents, and by testing offcuts they placed inside the chest alongside the main timber. Compare that to most modern hobbyist steam setups: a piece of PVC pipe, a wallpaper steamer, and fingers crossed. It works for thin stock. But for anything over about 1.5 inches, that setup simply cannot deliver enough sustained heat and moisture to soften the wood all the way through. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these shipwright methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called Secrets of the Shipyard, and it covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that most woodworkers have never seen. 150 pages of real hands-on knowledge. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. Now here is the part that changed everything for me: understanding what actually happens inside the wood during steaming. Because once you grasp this, steam bending stops being a mystery and starts being predictable. Wood is made up of cells, long hollow fibers bound together by a substance called lignin. You can think of lignin as the glue that holds the cell walls rigid. At room temperature, lignin is stiff. It resists deformation. That is why dry wood snaps when you try to force it into a curve. You are literally trying to bend a structure held together by a rigid adhesive. But lignin has a critical weakness. When you raise it above roughly 350 degrees Fahrenheit in a dry environment, it burns. However, when you combine heat with moisture, something remarkable happens at a much lower temperature. At around 200 degrees Fahrenheit, in the presence of steam and saturated moisture, lignin begins to soften. It transitions from a rigid, glassy state to a pliable, almost rubbery state. The technical term is the glass transition point, but what it means in practical terms is that the glue holding the wood fibers in place temporarily lets go. At the same time, another component of the cell wall called hemicellulose also softens and becomes flexible. Together, these changes mean that the entire wood structure can be deformed, bent into a curve, without the fibers snapping. The wood essentially behaves like a thick, stiff plastic. It does not want to move easily, but it can move without breaking. And here is the critical part. Once the wood cools and dries in its new shape, the lignin rehardens. The hemicellulose stiffens back up. The wood locks into the curve permanently. It has not been weakened. The fibers are all still intact, still running continuously along the length of the piece. That is why a steam-bent rib is so much stronger than one sawn to a curve. The grain follows the bend instead of running out of it. This is also why dry heat does not work. Without moisture, the lignin does not soften at bending temperatures. It just gets hot and stays rigid until it chars. Steam is the key because it delivers both heat and moisture simultaneously, and those two forces together are what unlock the wood's ability to flex. When I finally understood this, every failed bend in my past made sense. I had been working with kiln-dried wood that had too little moisture in the cell walls. I had been steaming for too short a time, so only the surface was pliable. I was essentially trying to bend wood, whose internal glue was still locked. Solid. No wonder it cracked. Now, softening the wood is only half the battle. You still have to actually bend a massive timber into a precise curve, and you have to do it fast, because the moment that steamed oak comes out of the chest, it starts cooling, and as it cools, the lignin begins to reharden. The shipwrights had roughly 3 to 5 minutes of working time on a heavy timber before it stiffened beyond the point of safe bending. 3 to 5 minutes to wrestle a piece of wood that might weigh several hundred pounds into a precise curve. This is where the scale and coordination of the naval yards was absolutely essential. They built heavy bending forms, called molds, shaped to the exact curve of the rib they needed. These molds were built from stacked timbers, bolted or pegged together, and anchored to the floor of the bending shed. When the steamed timber came out of the chest, a full crew moved it immediately to the mold. They used block and tackle systems, windlasses and long iron lever bars to pull and push the timber against the form. In some yards, they rigged ropes through pulleys mounted to the ceiling beams, using mechanical advantage to multiply the force of every man on the line. One critical technique they employed was managing the tension and compression sides of the bend. When you bend a timber, the outside of the curve stretches and the inside compresses. Wood handles compression reasonably well, but it is weak in tension. The fibers on the outside of the bend want to pull apart, and that is almost always where a crack starts. The shipwrights addressed this by using iron straps, thick metal bands that were clamped along the outside face of the timber before bending. The strap could not stretch, so it forced the outer fibers to stay together while the inner fibers compressed. This one technique alone dramatically increased the range of curves they could achieve without failure. Modern woodworkers know this as a compression strap, but the principle goes back centuries. The whole operation was fast, loud, and physically demanding. Men shouting coordination calls, steam rising off the hot timber in the cold air of the shed, the creak of the wood as it yielded to the curve. And through it all, the foreman watching for the first sign of trouble, a crack forming along the outer face, a sound like a muffled gunshot that meant a fiber bundle had let go inside. Once the timber was fully seated against the mold, it was clamped in place and left to cool and dry. Drying times varied, depending on the thickness of the timber and the conditions in the yard, but it was not unusual for a heavy rib to stay on the form for several weeks. The shipwrights knew that removing the timber too early meant springback, the tendency of the wood to partially straighten, as residual stresses released. To counteract this, they often overbent the timber slightly, shaping the mold to a tighter curve than the final rib required, so that after springback, the piece would settle into the correct shape. This is something I wish I had known 20 years ago. In my early bending attempts, I would pull the piece off the form after a few days, and every single time, it would spring back more than I expected. The shipwrights did not hope for the best. They planned for springback and built the correction right into the mold. That kind of thinking, anticipating the wood's behavior instead of reacting to it, is what separates their work from ours. Of course, not every bend succeeded. Even the best shipwrights lost timbers, a hidden knot buried inside the wood, a section of grain that twisted in a direction nobody could see from the surface, a boiler that lost pressure at the wrong moment, letting the timber cool before it was fully on the mold. When a timber failed, they could often hear it coming. A series of sharp snapping sounds from inside the wood, like twigs breaking, meant individual fiber bundles were letting go. If it was just a few, the timber might still be usable with some reinforcement, but a deep crack along the outer face meant the piece was done. It would be cut up for shorter, flatter components, and a new timber would be selected. The limits of steam bending were well understood in the yards. As a general rule, the minimum bend radius was roughly 15 to 20 times the thickness of the timber for white oak. So a 3-inch timber could be bent to a radius of about 45 to 60 inches. Anything tighter than that, and the failure rate climbed sharply. Species mattered too. Oak and ash bent beautifully. Elm was surprisingly good because of its interlocking grain. But maple was unpredictable, and most tropical hardwoods were nearly impossible to steam bend because of their density and resin content. Let me share some patterns I have noticed over the years, habits most of us fall into when we try steam bending. I did every one of these myself. The first pattern is reaching for kiln-dried lumber. It is what is available, and most of us assume dry wood is better wood. But for bending, kiln-dried stock has already lost the moisture inside its cell walls that makes steam bending possible. The shipwrights used green wood specifically because those saturated cell walls are what allow the lignin to soften properly. If you are serious about bending thick stock, seek out green or air-dried timber. It makes an enormous difference. The second pattern is understeaming. We get impatient. The steam box has been running for an hour, and we figure that is enough for a 2-inch board. But if the core has not reached temperature, you are bending a piece that is soft on the outside and rigid in the middle. It will crack from the inside out. The 1 hour per inch rule is a minimum, not a suggestion. The third pattern is moving too slowly. Once the wood is out of the steam box, every second counts. If you spend 2 minutes fiddling with clamps and adjusting the form, you have already lost half your working time. The shipwrights had everything set up and ready before the chest was opened. The form, the straps, the tackle, the crew. There was no improvising. The fourth pattern is ignoring the tension side of the bend. Most of us just muscle the wood around the form and hope it holds. Without something to restrain the outer fibers, the tension side will fail on any significant bend. A simple metal strap along the outside face, even a piece of steel strapping from the hardware store, can be the difference between a clean bend and a ruined board. Once you see these patterns for what they are, every future bending project gets easier. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This comes from several historical dockyard accounts I found while researching British naval records from the mid-1700s. Before steaming, the shipwrights would soak their bending timber in hot water for 12 to 24 hours. Not boiling, just hot, around 140 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. They would submerge the timber in long troughs fed by heated water. The purpose was to pre-saturate the wood and begin softening the lignin before the timber ever went into the steam chest. By the time steaming began, the wood was already warm and fully moisture saturated throughout its thickness, not just on the surface. This meant the steam could bring the lignin to its softening point faster and more uniformly. I tried this about 3 years ago on a piece of white oak that was 2.5 inches thick. I soaked it overnight in the hottest water my shop setup could manage, then steamed it the next morning. The difference was remarkable. The bend was smoother, more controlled, and there was not a single crack. I have done it on every thick bending project since, and my failure rate dropped to nearly 0. You will not find this in most modern steam bending guides, but the old shipwrights knew it worked, and it does. Now, if this kind of traditional shipwright knowledge is something you want to keep learning from, I have written a guide called Secrets of the Shipyard. It covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that have been perfected over centuries. The kind of stuff you will not find in most modern woodworking books. Scan the QR code right now or check the first link below. All right, let us continue. That is what the 1700s naval carpenters understood about bending oak. Not magic, not brute force, just a deep, practical understanding of what wood is made of and how to work with its nature instead of against it. I hope this gives you something useful for your own shop. Thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next one.